ध्वनिर्वर्णा पदं वाक्यमित्यास्पदचतुष्टयम् यस्याः सूक्ष्मादिभेदे वाग्देवीं तामुपास्महे।
The Electronic Media Production and Research Center EMPRC of Madhya Pradesh Bhoj Open University presents an audio program on English literature. This audio program will be useful to the students of BA first year. This audio program is based on the second unit of second paper titled Literature in English from 1750 to 1900 AD. The title of audio program is Tintern Abbey. We have invited our subject expert and speaker, Dr. Rajani Pande. Sound recorded, edited and presented by Amar Bahadur Yadav. Let's listen to the audio program Tintern Abbey.
Hello friends, I am Dr. Rajani Pande. In the last lesson, we discussed Wordsworth as a poet. We talked about his biographical details, literary background, factors which influenced his poetry, his basic themes, style, and his contribution to English poetry. In this session, we shall consider and appreciate Wordsworth's very significant long poem entitled Lines Written Above Tintern Abbey. The prime objectives of this session are to familiarize the learners with the basic theme of the poem, to enable the students to appreciate and analyze the various aspects of the poem, to familiarize the students with the poet's style, diction, and techniques. Now, my dear students, do you remember the basic aspects of Wordsworth's poetry? Well, Wordsworth was a poet of nature. His poems reflect his gradual growth as a poet of nature. Now, the title Tintern Abbey means Tintern is the name and Abbey means church. So, Tintern Abbey is a poem which reflects the poet's development as a lover of nature. It traces the 4 stages, that is, the period of blood, that is, wild feelings, the period of senses, the period of imagination, and the period of the soul. The poem was composed in July 1798. It was published 2 months later as the last poem of the first volume of the lyrical ballads. The poet himself says of its composition, "No poem of mine was composed under circumstances more pleasant for me to remember than this. I began it upon leaving Tintern after crossing the Wye, that is, the river, and concluded it just as I was entering Bristol, a town in England. After a ramble of 4 or 5 days, ramble means going here and there, roaming about, with my sister, not a line of it was altered till I reached Bristol." The previous visit referred to at the beginning of the poem was made alone and on foot in 1793. The second visit stirred up in him the thoughts and happy feelings produced by the first visit. Those thoughts had been with him all the time. Now those thoughts came back to him again with a special enjoyment. He himself has defined poetry as emotions recollected in tranquility. And this poem is a very good example of it. The poet revisits a landscape which he last saw 5 years ago. He considers how much the landscape has influenced him. He decides that since his last visit, he has grown more mature and has now a deeper understanding of humanity and nature. The entire poem contains about 159 lines, which are divided roughly into 5 stanzas. It is written in blank verse, that is, it does not have rhyming words at the end of the lines. Nevertheless, there is an internal rhythm and music which gives it a rare charm and serenity. The language is simple yet powerful. So let us first understand the significance and spirit of the poem. According to many critics, Tintern Abbey has a historical value. It is in fact the first clear statement of the emotional change in poetry of which the Romantic movement was the climax. It recognizes and defines the power of nature to quicken and sustain the imagination and creative faculty of man. Dear students, do you have the text of the poem in front of you? Please take out your text. We shall consider the poem according to the number of lines given in each stanza. In the first 22 lines of the poem, he describes the background of the poem. The poet says, 5 summers have passed, 5 summers with the length of 5 long winters, and again I hear these waters rolling from their mountain springs. The last lines of the stanzas are, or of some hermit's cave, where by his fire the hermit sits alone. The poet revisits Tintern Abbey, situated above the river Wye. He feels that a great change has taken place. There is a wide contrast between his experiences of the place 5 years ago and now, that is, his second visit presents a different scene. The landscape is the same, but his own mind has matured and developed. So, like a landscape painter, he sketches the details of the beautiful scene. The silent and quiet landscape, the lofty high cliffs, that is the mountains, rocks, and the sky make the place more secluded, that is lonely. There are orchards with unripe fruit, the wild, unkept and untrimmed hedges, groves, that is a cluster of trees, copses means shrubs, झाड़ियाँ जिनको बोलते हैं, irregular bushes are there around the landscape. The poet says that in that deep forest and wild landscape, the forest dwellers, that is the residents, had planted their own orchards. Some hermit or sage, that is sadhu, lives in his hut alone. The forest dwellers probably are cooking food because one can see the smoke rising above in the sky. In the next stanza, he says, these beauteous forms, through a long absence, have not been to me as is a landscape to a blind man's eye, but oft in lonely rooms and amid the din of towns and cities, I have owed to them. The last lines are, of harmony and the deep power of joy, we see into the life of things. This stanza contains about 35 lines. In these lines, he describes his debt to the beauty and power of the landscape. thrill of sensuous delight of that particular scene had always been with him. Dear students, the feelings that Wordsworth expresses in these lines are very familiar to all of us. Whenever we visit some lovely spot, the scene remains in our memory forever. It gives us happiness in moments of stress and strain. Similarly, the poet says that he had not been blind to the beauteous forms. In fact, while he was in cities and towns, amidst the noise and traffic of the cities, the beauty of the landscape gave him peace. All the stress and strain of urban life was relieved. Now he is back to this place, and slowly his bodily senses, mental feelings, and intellectual powers are getting refreshed. The scene also has a pleasing and moral effect on him. It also enhances his vision of the mystery of life. It made him realize the power of harmony and the power of joy that nature gave to him. So he says, "How oft in spirit I have turned to thee, O sylvan wye, thou wanderer through woods, how often has my spirit turned to thee?" In moments of stress and strain, the forest river Wye has helped him to become calm and peaceful. Thus, the message is that nature is a healer. It strengthens and fills one with energy. In the stanza beginning with the lines, "And now with the gleams of half-extinguished thought," till the lines, "of all my moral beings," the poet gives an account of the 4 stages in the growth of his attitude to nature. As a young boy, he experienced the animal joy or enjoyment of the unthinking boy. He says, "I bounded over the mountains by the sides of the deep rivers and lonely streams, more like a man flying from something that he dreads than one who sought the thing he loved." These lines describe the rushing boy fearing the mountain waterfalls, a mixture of happiness and fear. But that experience has matured into a youthful delight, an aesthetic passion, love for beauty, and then the feeling changes into an understanding of the still, sad music of humanity. It is a realization of the sadness of life. Later, the poet realizes the beauty and mystery of life. The poet here adopts an autobiographical tone. His earlier visit gave him animal pleasure, youthful delight, and then he sensed the deep, sad music of humanity. This helped him to become more sympathetic to all humanity. Thus, love for nature generates in him love for all fellow beings. This love is later transformed into an ennobling experience. In the concluding lines of the poem, he addresses his sister Dorothy, "My dear, dear friend, and in thy voice I catch the language of my former heart, and read my former pleasures in the shooting lights of thy wild eyes. Oh, yet a little while, may I behold in thee what I was once, my dear, dear sister, and this prayer I make, knowing that nature never did betray the heart that loved her." Wordsworth recognizes the same animal pleasure in his sister's eye. He tells her how he also reacted similarly. And then he tells her how nature came to his help when he was among greedy, jealous people. Wordsworth cleverly sketches the picture of social evils, people with evil tongues, no kindness, the daily grind of tiring life. He blesses her and says, "Let the moon shine on thee in thy solitary walk, and let the misty mountains wind be free to blow against thee." Then he says, when the sensuous pleasures are transformed into sober pleasure, and when her mind is matured enough to receive the lovely forms of nature, then her mind will become a dwelling place for all sweet sounds and harmonies. Wordsworth ends the poem by saying, "Wilt thou then forget that on the banks of this delightful stream we stood together, and that I, so long a worshipper of nature, hither came, unwearied in that service? Wilt thou then forget that after many wanderings, many years of absence, these steep woods and lofty cliffs, and this green pastoral landscape were to me more dear, to both for themselves and thy sake?" Wordsworth wishes that Dorothy may also experience the richness and mystic quality of nature, which transforms an animal into a being who has experienced the humanizing effect of nature. Nature not only humanizes, but she also sublimates and enlarges one's heart and mind. Wordsworth ends the poem with a prayer that Dorothy may also cherish and treasure the eternal blessings of nature. The poet Tintern Abbey is a testament of Wordsworth's philosophy of nature. He believed in the healing power of nature, therefore he reiterates or reinforces his belief in the divine power of nature. Tintern Abbey is the first poem in which Wordsworth's genius finds its fullest expression. Its blank verse moves with a quiet vigor and power as it moves from one mood to another. It is a wonderful piece of poetic eloquence. Some critics compare it with the Bible's Sermon on the Mount. It is like a prayer. From the rough and coarse level of the physical experience, he leads us to the intellectual plane or level of life. My dear students, when we read the poem in full, we can realize its greatness. The theme is indeed very serious, but Wordsworth deals with the philosophical theme in such a simple style and language that the whole poem becomes a philosophical statement. Why did he choose the blank verse for composing the poem? Can you give some reasons? Well, dear students, first of all, Wordsworth wanted to present his theory or philosophy of nature through this poem. When the subject is so serious, the medium of expression also has to be serious. Milton wrote his famous epic Paradise Lost in blank verse. His subject was about God, angels, Satan, and man. It dealt with the religious history of God and man. Moreover, blank verse gives the poet or writer the freedom to express his thoughts and feelings. Another important reason was that Wordsworth disliked the traditional rhyming verse because it restricted the creativity of the artist. Another reason why he chose the blank verse was that he wanted to give it a conversational flavor. Do you understand the meaning of the phrase conversational flavor? It means that he wanted it to be like a conversation between himself and his sister. It also appears like a counseling session. The poet, while describing his own experience, tries to convince his sister how nature is an eternal giver. And if man associates himself with nature in word and spirit, then he is blessed and ennobled. The poem, despite its length and serious theme, captures the spirit of romanticism. It retains the poet's preference for a free style of writing poetry. Yet the poem has a musical quality. It has an internal rhythm. Wordsworth, as a singer, turns into a painter. The first stanza is a lovely exercise in describing pastoral landscape. The second stanza or passage is a brilliant exercise in transforming scenes into verse. In simple yet powerful language, Wordsworth translates or expresses the significance of nature in acting as a shield to protect him from the weariness or drudgery of ordinary materialistic life. We all know that we get totally involved in the activities that are related to materialistic gains. These activities also make us emotionally, intellectually, and morally weak. But nature's power of joy and harmony charge our weak batteries. They make our entire being joyful, happy, and provide us with intellectual and moral pleasure. Through his love of nature, he also develops love of man. He says, his little nameless, unremembered acts of kindness and of love, nor less I trust, to them I may have owed another gift, of aspects more sublime, that blessed mood, in which the burthen of mystery, in which the heavy and the weary weight of all this unintelligible world is lightened. The mystery of this world, that is nature's mystery, gradually awakens our spiritual self. We forget the burthen, which means the burden or weight of this physical world, and achieve a state of harmony and the power of joy. This joy can be likened to the concept of Satchidanand. As long as we are aware of the physical world, we are not conscious of the divine world. But as we meditate and communicate with our inner power, nature blesses us with serenity and ecstasy, that is Satchidanand. We human beings are doubting Thomases. That is, Thomas was a philosopher who doubted the divine power of God. He was a skeptic and debated the presence of divinity in nature. Wordsworth's immense faith in nature's divine power strengthened him morally as well as spiritually. His first visit to Tintern Abbey gave him sufficient spiritual strength to face the challenges of the physical world. Now the second visit gives him hope, courage, and inner vision to realize the power of joy and ecstasy. The beauty of Wordsworth's poetry lies in his description of nature in words which are commonly used. According to his theory of poetry, the language of poetry should be the language of the common man. Except for words like thou and thy, which were in use at that time, the language used is easily understood. In conclusion, we can say that this poem is Wordsworth's central statement of his faith in the restorative and associative power of nature. He describes the development of his own love of nature from the coarser pleasure. Coarser means rough, physical, low, physical pleasures. From the coarser pleasures of boyhood through the aching joys of youth to the more reflective and philosophic pleasures of maturity, which is inspired by the still sad music of humanity. In the end, dear students, we see that the poem Tintern Abbey is a symbol of Wordsworth's worship of nature. Nature at all stages of our lives makes us experience its pleasures in various forms. At every stage of life, we experience her power of joy. Nature quietens us, gives us peace, and enlarges our mind and heart. Wordsworth truly says, well pleased to recognize in nature and the language of the sense the anchor of my purest thoughts, the nurse, the guide, the guardian of my heart and soul, of all my moral being. Well, dear students, we have learnt in this session about the basic theme of Tintern Abbey. We have also understood how the poem elaborates Wordsworth's attitude towards nature. We have also talked about his poetic technique, use of blank verse, and the type of language he uses to express the most difficult concept of philosophy. I hope you have enjoyed the session. Read the poem again and again, and you'll be able to understand the basic progress of Wordsworth's thought. Now, the most frequently asked questions on the poem are: discuss the theme of the poem Tintern Abbey. Support your statements with appropriate examples from the poem. Now, in this particular question, you have to discuss the main theme of the poem. In the lecture, we have discussed the main theme of the poem. So, support your statements with appropriate examples from the poem. You should read the poem very carefully and use lines which illustrate and support your statements. It is very important to study the poem and try to remember or memorize important lines, because if you give examples from the text, the examiner will definitely give you better marks. The second question is: write a critical appreciation of lines written above Tintern Abbey. The whole lecture, in fact, is a critical appreciation of the poem. So you can take points from the lecture and write a critical appreciation of the poem Tintern Abbey. The third question is: what did Wordsworth mean when he said that we should let nature be our teacher? The answer to this question is in the part that discusses nature as a teacher. Nature teaches, although nature, if we communicate with nature, it tells us, it gives us messages that tell us how should we understand life and how should we behave and accept the challenges of life. So in the lecture itself, you will find nature as a teacher. Why is Tintern Abbey regarded as the central statement of Wordsworth's philosophy of nature? And the answer to this question again is in the lecture itself. Poem is important because it elaborates Wordsworth's philosophy of nature, and it also traces the development of Wordsworth's attitude towards nature. The fifth question is: trace the development of Wordsworth's attitude to nature as illustrated in the poem Tintern Abbey. This question is very similar to question number 4. So, I hope you have enjoyed the session. Thank you very much for giving a very patient hearing. Hope we'll meet again. Wish you all the best. Bye.
You were just listening an audio program Tintern Abbey. Subject expert and speaker was Dr. Rajani Pande. Announcer was Vinita Jain. This audio program was recorded, edited and presented by Amar Bahadur Yadav. This program was produced by the Electronic Media Production and Research Center EMPRC of Madhya Pradesh Bhoj Open University.